Almost 2 years after the landmark Constitutional Court judgment legalizing the private use of cannabis, the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill has been introduced. High hopes have been dashed, though. On the 18th of September 2018, the Constitutional Court ordered that the private consumption and cultivation of cannabis be decriminalized. Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo delivered the judgment, which confirmed that Sections 4B and 5B of the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act, read in part with Section 22A, 9A1 of the Medicines and Related Substances Control Act, were constitutionally invalid. Now, the court noted that the right of privacy was not necessarily limited to a person's home, and its order went broader than the High Court judgment, allowing adults to use cannabis in other private places. But the bill has come in for some stinging criticism for failing to live up to the spirit of the Apex Court's ruling. So how did we get here, and what happens next? Let's welcome our panel to find out. Paul Michael Keikel, partner at Schindler's Attorneys, and the firm have been experts in the cannabis field for the last decade. Schindler's rise to prominence in this area of law really began back in 2013 when it took on the so-called Dacha couple as clients and started leading their challenge to have the laws prohibiting cannabis use and possession declared unconstitutional in the country. We're also joined by Keith Scott. He's chairman of the South African Drug Policy Initiative. He's a medical doctor who's worked in South Africa, in the UK, New Zealand and Botswana, and arrived, in fact, in Botswana shortly after the HIV virus did, and experienced firsthand how government inertia, ignorance and prejudice allowed the AIDS pandemic to devastate that country and its neighbours, and the unfortunate similarities between the erroneous HIV/AIDS policies and those governing the use and trade in illegal psychoactive substances has convinced him to become involved with the global movement that demands more humane, rational and effective drug policies. We've also got in the room Andrew MacPherson, Senior Associate in the Dispute Resolution Practice at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr, and Pietri Redlinghuys, founder of Arena Capital Advisors, an investor into the budding green economy. Paul Michael, kick us off. You led the Constitutional Court challenge, and before we dive into the current legislation, how did we get here? Where did your journey to legalize cannabis begin?
My journey personally began when I wrote an essay in final year law that criticized the original Prince judgment, Prince being Russ Gareth Prince, who actually was the main applicant alongside Jeremy Acton in the Constitutional Court. I ended up representing the so-called Dacha couple, that's Myrtle Clark and the late and great Julian Stobbs, and we fought the trial of the plant in the Pretoria High Court. And then when Prince and Acton's matter was going to the Constitutional Court, our matter having been rendered part heard, we made the election to intervene in the Constitutional Court because we were a little bit concerned that some of the applicant plaintiffs were lay people, legal lay people at least, and we wanted to take what they were saying and translate it into a form that would be palatable to the Constitutional Court justices, which I think we did meaningfully contribute to.
And in terms of that Constitutional Court ruling 2 years ago, without getting into the technical details, what was the spirit of that ruling?
The real spirit of the ruling is that, it's twofold. It's that it was based on the right to privacy, which is to say that whatever an adult, without harming others, wants to do in the privacy of their own home or the privacy of another private space ought not to be the realm of government. You can only limit rights in terms of the Bill of Rights on the basis of trying to prevent harms. There are legitimate state objectives to be served and there are illegitimate state objectives, and there was no meaningful evidence put up by the state that they were serving a legitimate state objective or minimizing any harms by continuing to criminally prohibit adults from doing what they wanted in their private spaces, specifically in relation to cannabis.
And Dr. Scott, to bring you in here, I mean, the fact that cannabis is freely used and widely available in South Africa, it is still considered by some as a gateway drug, and there is still a strong lobby against decriminalization and legalization. From your vantage point and having worked in the field for such a long time, what do you make of those arguments to keep cannabis as a criminally banned substance?
Well, I think they're completely wrong. But just to paraphrase an old saying, we've closed the gate after the horse has bolted, if you're thinking in terms of cannabis being a gateway drug, because it's been around, widely used for decades. And obviously, it's totally untrue. There are many reasons why we shouldn't continue to criminalize people who use and trade in cannabis. I can't go into the whole list, but certainly the bill as it stands has not is not in line with the spirit of the Constitutional Court ruling. And I'd just like to point out at the start of this discussion that the government fought the applicants right through for many years. As Paul Michael, he was involved, he would know. And so we've got a government now in Parliament that's trying its damnedest to actually make this bill as difficult as possible for people to follow. And it's discriminatory in that it discriminates against poor people who haven't actually got private space whatsoever in townships and informal settlements.
And I mean, the context is one of a government that we saw through lockdown that would gladly get rid of our freedoms to smoke cigarettes or even drink alcohol if it was given the choice. And that is an important point of departure. Andrew, from your vantage point, when it comes to the bill, the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill, as it's become known, what was the expectation among those with skin in the game of what this bill would achieve? Surely wholesale legalization at this point might have been slightly over-optimistic. What was the expectation?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I don't think anybody really expected that Parliament would sit there and draft this all-encompassing, incredibly progressive legislation. But what one could have hoped was that this would have sparked some sort of discussion, some sort of more progressive thinking. How can we incorporate cannabis, in the economy with regards to, I mean, there's, the benefits, I don't need to list them. Everybody seems to sort of know them now, but there's the tax revenue that would have been massively beneficial. As we know, there's about a 300 billion rand hole in tax collections. There's the jobs that could be created. There's the way that we could bring farmers that currently participate in the informal economy into the formal economy by allowing what they're doing to be, to allow the cannabis they're growing, rather than feeding the illicit trade, but rather to be fed into labs that are manufacturing, or to export it, or to do something within the formal economy, which would also contribute to the tax. There's a number of things that could be done, but the bill is so limited in its scope. They haven't given a single inch more than they needed to do in terms of what was mandated by the Constitutional Court, and to me that's disappointing. I also can sense from some of the details on the bill that it's not what we were hoping for. For example, the bill's put out by the Department of Justice and Correctional Services, which to some extent there's a logic behind that. But at the same time, you would think, where's the Department of Health, and where's the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Finance? Where are these departments in all of this? Because there's so much, we're looking a gift horse in the mouth. And to sort of build on Mr. Scott's quote, we're looking a gift horse in the mouth, and that horse is already bolted. There's so much that we could be doing, and so much that could have been done in this opportunity to legislate that they've just sort of neglected to do. And we don't know currently if their failure, for example, to address any commercial aspects of cannabis, whether it's farming or opening grow clubs or even dispensaries, their failure to address any commercial aspects, is that because there's another bill coming? Should we be expecting some further commercially based legislation? Or is there just no interest in going that way at all? We just don't know. And it's particularly interesting when you hear the president speaking at SONA, and he's talking about how cannabis, the commercialization of cannabis, is going to be front and center in 2020. And you even see the finance minister Tito Mbowene's tweeting nonstop about his cannabis plants in his garden. There just seems to be a disconnect between what we're seeing out of the legislature and what we're seeing, what's being said to us.
Yeah, when he's not tweeting about what he's cooking between Mopani worms and Lucky Star pilchards, he is tweeting about his cannabis plantation in Mkhubo's Kloof. To carry on.
Well, let's hope he doesn't mix up the two. He doesn't start cooking with his cannabis.
We'll move on to edibles, Pietri. I want to move on though with the the horse analogy, the equine analogy. You've got a lovely filly in the back there. I'm assuming it's a filly. Are there jockeys, from your perspective, as an investor, that you're seeing in the South African marketplace who are willing to sink capital and their expertise and time into this budding sector, that are just waiting for some kind of legislative certainty? What are you seeing from your vantage point?
So, well, thank you for having me. I think firstly, let's start there. I think there's a few comments that I can make here. There's been a number of licenses that have been sort of granted for commercial cannabis farming operations. Primarily, they come with a lot of terms and conditions attached. You have to export. You have to have offtake agreements with licensed I want to say processors of cannabis, people who can convert it into some sort of medicinal purpose or whatever the case is. So it's relatively heavily regulated from that perspective, that you can't just plant a farm and get going. You have to have licensed customers, if you can put it that way. So we've seen a number of these licenses being granted, and there's been quite I want to say, an uptake from very entrepreneurial individuals and companies who are wanting to enter into the space. However, there are some challenges where, because this is a controlled substance to a large degree, still you have to have very high security, and also farming is not cheap, right? To start a farm, particularly one of commercial grade, is a good couple of million rands worth of investment. So what I'm finding is that it's difficult to find private equity investors to fund these projects. It seems that there's a lot of interest in people entering into the space, and a lot of competition on the horizon in that space. But to find these individuals or these entrepreneurs, the capital that they need to start these businesses is proving somewhat difficult. So I don't think that there's a huge appetite from the investment perspective, at least for local production, because maybe that rests on the legislative problem where, we can only sell to offshore customers and we can't grow and sell locally. So it's a bit of a high risk space. And right now there's, I think, over 100 licenses that have been granted. So perhaps investors are also just waiting to see which of those make it and which of those fail.
It's a very interesting space, Paul Michael, from the commercial perspective, because what we see in California and other states that have led the way in terms of legalization is perhaps not the quick wins that some were expecting. Particularly, I've seen a study out of the Golden State saying that while they were predicted to rake in just over 640 million in taxes, it's been about half of that. And the reason being is that the government there chose to heavily tax cannabis. So the sin taxes on cannabis were so large that you've still got an incentive to remain invested in the black market, and the black market hasn't really disappeared. There are obviously lessons for us here in South Africa. If we're to fully commercialize, we have to be aware of not eating the golden goose all the way up to the ovaries, so to speak, and to overtax this. But I suppose that's a conversation that's almost getting ahead of itself. What does this bill say around commercialization?
Says almost nothing, as Andrew pointed out. What it does say is it has purported to change the definition of dealing in cannabis in terms of the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act. And there's a prohibition and there's a crime created insofar as one deals in cannabis, unless in terms of another act of parliament. So perhaps that foreshadows that there will be another act of parliament or a bill that relates to the commercial trade in cannabis. But of course, if you're going to make it too difficult and too expensive for the average person to get involved in that trade, then you're going to face the same California problem. What we really want is a craft trade in cannabis, the small backyard farmer or the person out in the rural Transkei who can now slap a brand onto their cannabis and be able to earn some money from that. And there's certainly nothing in the bill that speaks to that sort of right, or even snatching at that sort of opportunity. So that certainly is a wasted opportunity. I think everybody here agrees on that.
Yeah, and it comes back to Andrew's point about the bill made one of its major problems is the fact that it was not broadly consulted. It doesn't seem to be broadly consulted. The Department of Justice and Correctional Services doesn't seem to have consulted with Treasury, with the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health to see how we could have a more holistic approach to this. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation on the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill. High hopes certainly dashed at this stage.